Looking back, I'm almost ashamed of how scared I was that night. On a weekend hike with a group of friends. I remember it vividly because, well, it's not the kind of thing that's easy to forget. We were in the Adirondacks, in one of those places where you have to hike for miles, with no cell phone service, no light except for the stars and a campfire. It was a perfect night, cool but not cold, clear skies, and we all just sat around laughing and telling silly stories. We set up camp near the forest on the shore of the lake, and when night fell, we realized that we were running out of firewood. I volunteered to collect firewood from trees a little further away. I didn't really think about it. I had been hiking many times. I knew how to navigate the forest. But that night I felt different. However, I decided that it was just the usual excitement that comes with being in a dark forest. I grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the trees, scanning the ground for fallen branches. The beam only reached a few feet ahead, and everything outside that circle of light was pitch black. My footsteps crunched on the forest floor, each step echoing as if I were the only living thing in the forest. I had only walked maybe 50 yards, but it felt like much more. The deeper I went, the quieter it got around me. No sounds from the lake, no wind. Just silence. I was about to go back, thinking I had collected enough firewood, when I got this feeling. You know, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. It seemed like someone was watching me. I stopped, holding my breath, listening for anything, footsteps, a voice, anything that could tell me I was not alone. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. His face. Pale, grotesque, with empty, staring eyes and a mouth open as if in a scream. It was peeking out from behind a tree, maybe 20 feet away, barely visible in the edge of my flashlight beam. My heart jumped into my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. I just stared at that face, waiting for it to blink, move, or do something. But it didn't blink. It just stood there, looking at me with its empty eyes. I dropped the firewood and ran back through the forest to the camp, ignoring the noise and the branches scratching my arms and face. All I could think about was that I had to get away from this creature. I could swear I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I just kept running until I saw the glow of a campfire and jumped out into the clearing, out of breath and wild-eyed. My friends Ryan, Chris, and Sarah looked at me in fright. I must have looked like I had seen a ghost, because Chris laughed and asked if I had seen Bigfoot. "Guys," I exclaimed breathlessly, "there's something there, a face. A face that's just looking at me from behind a tree." Ryan raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "A face? Dude, are you sure you didn't just see a deer or something?" "No," I insisted, my voice shaking. "It was a face. Pale, with dead eyes and a huge gaping mouth. It was. I don't even know how to describe it. It didn't look right." They exchanged glances, a mixture of amusement and concern, before Chris stood up. "Okay, let's go check it out. Come on, Mike, show us your monster." I didn't really want to go back out there, but the thought of them being with me, a group, and not me alone in the dark made it a little easier. I nodded and grabbed the flashlight again, leading them back to the spot where I had dumped the wood. We moved through the trees together, the four of us, holding on to each other, flashlights piercing the darkness. I kept looking back, half expecting to see that face looking at me from the shadows again. My friends were talking and joking, probably trying to keep the mood light, but I was tense, barely able to keep my hands steady. Finally, we reached the place where I dropped the firewood. The branches were scattered on the ground just as I had left them, and I pointed to the tree where I had seen that face. "It was right there," I said, my voice a barely audible whisper. "It was peeking out from behind that tree." Sarah rolled her eyes, clearly unconvinced. "So where's your monster, Mike?" I scanned the area, shining my flashlight through the trees. And then I saw it again. The face. It was still peeking out from behind the same tree, pale, empty eyes staring at us, mouth wide open in a frozen scream. I froze, my heart pounding. "There!" I said, pointing, my voice trembling. "Do you see him?" Everyone turned their flashlights toward the tree, and for a moment there was silence. Then Chris let out a low whistle. What the hell? Ryan squinted as he moved closer. Is that a head? I swallowed hard, feeling my stomach twist. The face looked just as disturbing up close as it did from a distance. It was pale and cracked, with bits of moss growing over it, its eyes empty and lifeless, staring out of hollow sockets. Sarah stepped forward, her curiosity obviously stronger than her fear, and shone her flashlight directly at it. It's not real, she said, relieved and disgusted at the same time. Look, it's just foam. We all came closer, and sure enough, the head was attached to a stick propped up behind a tree. Up close, it looked even more creepy and rotten, as if it had been there for years, maybe even decades. The styrofoam was yellowed and cracked, the mouth was wide open, and the empty eyes seemed almost alive in the dim light. Who would leave something like this here? I asked, feeling a strange mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. Ryan shrugged his shoulders. Probably some kids playing here. Or maybe some vacationers with a twisted sense of humor. Chris laughed, clicking his phone. Well, I have to admit, Mike, you know how to scare yourself. I forced myself to laugh, trying to shake off the lingering fear. Now that we were all there, it seemed ridiculous that I had been so scared. But something about that face still bothered me, something I couldn't understand. We got back to camp, and while everyone else was sitting around the campfire, Chris pulled out his phone to look at the photo he had taken. He zoomed in, giggling to himself. You have to see it up close. It looks even creepier in the photo. He passed the phone around, and when I looked at the screen, a chill ran through me. The face looked different. In the photo, it seemed more realistic, the eyes darker, almost empty, as if something was looking at us from the inside. The mouth looked wider, stretched out in a grotesque smile that didn't exist in real life. Doesn't it look different? I asked, my voice barely audible. Sarah raised an eyebrow. It's just a rotten styrofoam head, Mike. You let your imagination get the better of you. And here's a picture of that head. I'm 42 now, but I swear that night feels like it was yesterday. I was only 17, full of teenage bravado, thinking I knew everything. If you had told me then that I would be haunted by what happened, I would have laughed. But here I am, decades later, and I still can't shake it. It was a warm evening, the end of summer. The kind of evening when the sun stays out as long as it can, leaving a battered orange color in the sky that slowly turns into a deep blue. I went out to the forest behind my old neighborhood. I just needed to get some air, to be in space, away from the usual noise of home. The forest was my solitude, you know? A place where I could be alone. I was about to go back when I heard a soft cry, like a child in pain or lost. It was not one of those distant sounds that you convince yourself you are only imagining. No, it was close, very close. I froze, straining to listen, and there it was again, that tiny voice just floating through the trees. Help, please. Normally, I would have just called out, hey, are you okay? But something stopped me. The voice, it was strange. It was weak and soft, as if it was fading in and out. I couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl, but it sounded young, too young to be there alone. Against all my instincts, I started walking towards him. It was as if some invisible thread was pulling me forward. The air became heavier, almost thick, and with each step the trees around me seemed taller and darker. It was almost pitch black now, with only a few streaks of light cutting through the foliage, but they were enough to cast strange shadows on the ground. Hello? I called out, trying to sound calm. It seemed that my voice just froze in the air, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. The only response was a faint scream, and it came from deep within. I had to leave. Turn around and run back to the city, but something inside me wouldn't let go. I had to find out who she was, what she was doing here. So, against all odds, I followed her. The path was barely visible, but her footprints were clear and led me deep into the forest. I kept my eyes on them, moving as quietly as I could, and my heart was pounding so hard it hurt. It seemed like hours had passed, but I knew it was only minutes. Suddenly, I heard her again, her voice echoing in the trees, a soft whisper that seemed to be right next to me, even though I couldn't see her. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I spun around, trying to find her, but there was nothing. Just shadows and trees. My skin tingled, and I felt an icy fear settle in the pit of my stomach. I was beginning to realize that I had made a huge mistake. Before I could react, the voice came again, softer this time, as if she were standing right behind me. "It's too late to leave." That was it. I turned and ran, running back the way I had come, branches slapping my face and arms. I did not care. I just needed to get out of here. The shadows seemed to stretch out, reaching for me, and each step became slower, heavier, as if the forest was pulling me back. Finally, I broke through the trees, stumbling into a clearing at the edge of the forest. I turned around, out of breath, half expecting to see her standing there, looking at me. But the forest was empty. I stayed there, holding my breath, trembling all over. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the shadow, waiting for her to reappear. But it never did. Eventually, I turned around and walked home, leaving the forest behind. But that night, as I lay in bed, her words echoed in my head, over and over again. "It's too late to leave." I didn't close my eyes. I don't know what came over me after that second meeting. It was as if she had infected my mind, haunting my every thought. I saw her in flashes in the reflection of a shop window, in the crowd, her ghostly figure flickering for a second and then disappearing again. I could still feel the cold grip of her hand, still hear that desperate whisper, "Don't leave me." The next few days passed in a blur. My friends started asking if I was okay, but what could I say? I didn't sleep. I hardly ate anything. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for me there in the forest, alone and scared. I knew I had to go back. I had to find out who or what she was. But this time I couldn't go alone. I needed someone who could see what I was seeing and tell me I wasn't going crazy. I thought of my best friend, Tom. He had been my mate since childhood. He followed me almost everywhere, and he believed me, at least I hoped he would. One day I took him aside and told him everything. I almost expected him to laugh, but to my surprise, he just stared at me with a serious face. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "I don't know, man," he said, rubbing the back of his head. "It sounds crazy, but I believe you. I mean, if you say you saw her, you saw her. And if she exists, we have to help her, right?" Relief washed over me. Tom's reaction gave me a sliver of hope, a reason to believe that I was not alone in this. So that night, we headed to the forest together. I tried to keep my nerves under control, but as soon as we entered the shadows, I was gripped by a familiar fear that pierced me to the bone. We walked in silence, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Tom tried to keep it casual, cracking jokes here and there, but I could see that he was nervous too. The air was thick and heavy, and the silence pressed down on us, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. After a while, we came to the clearing where I had last seen her. I stopped, peering into the trees, my heart pounding as I waited for any sign of her presence. But the clearing was empty. "Are you sure this is the place?" Tom asked, his voice a whisper. I nodded, my eyes darting around, trying to catch any movement. She was right here. I swear. We waited, the minutes dragging on, each one heavier than the last. I could feel my heart sinking, doubts creeping in. Had I made it all up? Or was she just a figment of my imagination, a ghost conjured up by my own mind? Just as I was about to give up, I heard a soft rustling from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. My pulse quickened, and I grabbed Tom's hand, pointing to the source of the noise. And then we saw her. She stepped out from among the trees, her small, pale figure almost glowing in the moonlight. She looked the same as before, dirty, disheveled, with wide and empty eyes. But this time there was something different in her expression, something almost pleading. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. I don't want to be alone anymore. Tom's face paled. His hand clutched the flashlight. Jesus, Mike, she's real. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Yeah, I barely managed to say, barely able to speak. The girl took a step towards us, her eyes fixed on me. You're back, she said, her voice a mixture of relief and sadness. Will you help me? I didn't know what to say. Hundreds of questions were running through my head, but before I could say anything, Tom stepped forward. How can we help you? He asked, his voice surprisingly calm. The girl's gaze shifted to him, her expression softening. I'm lost, she said in a barely audible whisper. I need to get home. Where is your home? I asked, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. She looked down, her small hands clasped together. I don't remember. It was so long ago. I just want to go home. I was overcome with an uneasy feeling. It seemed to me that we were standing on the edge of something huge, something dark and dangerous, and one wrong step could drag us there. But now I couldn't back down. I had to find out the truth. What's your name? I asked, hoping it would help her remember. For a moment, she just looked at me with a blank face. Then she slowly shook her head. I don't know. I think I was Emma once. But it was a long time ago. A shiver ran down my spine. I used to be? What would that mean? I looked at Tom, who looked as nervous as I was. But before I could ask her anything else, she turned and started walking towards the trees, her steps slow and unhurried, as if she was being pulled forward by something beyond her control. We followed her, unable to do anything else. She led us deeper into the forest, into a part one had never seen before. The trees here were older, the branches twisted, the bark dark and cracked. The feeling was wrong, as if we had entered a completely different world. Finally, we came to a small clearing overgrown with weeds and bushes. In the middle was an old well, its stones worn and crumbling, half hidden by moss. The girl stopped in front of it, peering into the darkness. This is where it happened, she whispered, her voice trembling. This is where I got lost. Tom and I exchanged glances, both concerned. I didn't understand what she meant, but I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on us, thick and suffocating. Emma, I said quietly, coming closer. What happened to you? She looked up at me, her eyes filled with such deep sadness that it hurt to watch. I was playing here, a long time ago. I fell in. I never came out. The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. I felt my stomach drop as the realization hit me. She was not just a lost child. She was something else, something trapped, bound to this place by a fate she could not escape. Before I could react, she reached out, her small hand touching my arm, her touch icy. Will you stay with me? She whispered, her voice desperate, pleading. I pulled away, fear gripping me. I can't, I stammered, backing away. Her face fell, her eyes filled with ancient sorrow. Please. I don't want to be alone. I looked at Tom, who stood frozen, his face pale. He seemed to be as trapped as I was, caught under the weight of her gaze. Finally, he found his voice. We have to go, he said, his voice shaking. I nodded, forcing myself to turn away from her. Every step felt like a betrayal, like I was leaving her again and again. But I knew that if I stayed, I might never leave. As we walked back through the forest, I could feel her eyes on me, watching us, waiting. The air was heavy, the silence was thick, and I knew that whoever she was not done with us yet. I had just gotten a new job in a small town in the middle of nowhere, and I needed a place to live. I didn't have a lot of money, so when I saw this old country house for sale for next to nothing, I thought I had hit the jackpot. Of course, it looked a little worse in the photos, but I didn't care. I just needed somewhere cheap to stay, to have a roof over my head while I got settled. So I went for it. It was a large 2-story house standing on the edge of the forest, the kind you would see in some forgotten painting, with cracked paint and dusty windows. The realtor didn't tell me much about the history of the house, only that it had been empty for many years, but I didn't ask questions. To be honest, I was a little embarrassed by how excited I was. It was mine, and for that price, I felt like it was the deal of a lifetime. The first sign that something was different about this place? It was the locals. When I moved here, I would go out into town to get groceries or go into a little diner, and people would look at me for too long, like they wanted to say something but couldn't bring themselves to. And whenever I mentioned the house, just a conversation, like, "Oh, it has such a peaceful view," it would shut up very quickly, very quickly. Once I asked a cashier in a grocery store if she knew anything about this place. She hesitated, just looked at me. Her face suddenly became serious. Then she shook her head. "You should be careful," she muttered, avoiding eye contact. I laughed. I thought it was just one of those small-town quirks, Maybe some local folklore that's been passed around a few times too many. But I'm not one of those who believe in ghost stories. I've seen a lot of old buildings, and sure, they could be creepy, but that didn't mean they were haunted. So I moved here and started to clean it up a little bit. For the first few days, everything was fine, at least for the most part. But soon enough, little things started happening. Things that could have been dismissed as coincidences. The lights flickered, even though I checked the wiring myself. At first I thought it was an old short or a light bulb, but it kept happening again and again, even after I checked every bulb. Then there were the sounds. This house made you feel like you were not alone. I was sitting on the couch, maybe reading or just relaxing, and suddenly I heard the faint creaking of the floorboards upstairs. At first I thought it was just the house going down, but it started to get louder, more purposeful, almost like footsteps. It was a sound that could not be ignored, that made you stop whatever you were doing and just listen. One night, as I was going to bed, climbing the old creaky stairs, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from the other end of the corridor. I froze, just standing there in the dark, my heart pounding. I tried to convince myself that it was my imagination, but the sound was so clear, so constant. Then, when I turned the flashlight in the direction of the noise, it stopped. I didn't know what to think. I've never believed in ghosts, I've never been one to be easily frightened, but this house, it had a way of getting under your skin. That was just the beginning. After that night, things got even weirder. I told myself it was just the creaks and groans of an old house, but deep down I knew something was wrong. Every night, I would hear strange sounds, soft footsteps, the faint creak of a door opening by itself. Sometimes it even seemed like someone was whispering, barely audible. I tried to ignore it, hiding my head under the pillow, but the house seemed to want me to know that it was not empty. One night, I decided to look around, to see if there was an animal, or some logical explanation for these sounds. I got up, took a flashlight and went room by room, checking for anything out of the ordinary. I checked every closet, every corner, and even the basement, if you can believe it. There was nothing there. Just me, alone in this cold, dusty house, with the feeling that I was being watched. In the morning, I would go into the kitchen to make coffee and see that the cupboard doors were wide open, even though I had closed them the night before. The lights flickered, just for a second, when I entered certain rooms. And this feeling, this constant, heavy feeling that I was being watched all the time, never left me. One evening I was sitting in the living room watching the sun sink behind the trees outside. Everything was calm, even peaceful. I almost convinced myself that it was all just my imagination, that I was letting the local stories get to me. But then, as soon as night fell, the lights went out. The darkness was sudden and complete, engulfing the room in an unnatural way. I sat there with my heart pounding, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the darkness, for something to break the silence. But nothing happened. Only a heavy, suffocating silence pressed from all sides. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and for the first time I thought that maybe I was not alone. I forced myself to get up and grab a flashlight. I groped, feeling my way through the hallway to the junction box. I thought I heard breathing, deep, slow breathing, as if someone was standing right behind me. I turned around, shining my flashlight, but there was nothing there. Just an empty corridor stretching into the darkness. Finally, I turned the light back on, but I didn't feel any better. On the contrary, I felt even more vulnerable. I tried to get rid of this feeling by telling myself that it was just an old house behaving like this, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. After the lights went out, I was constantly on edge. Every sound, every shadow seemed to hide something. I barely slept, jumping up at every creak and groan. I tried everything to rationalize what was happening, to convince myself that it was all just in my head, but nothing worked. The house had its own energy, and it was getting stronger and stronger, gathering around me. One night I went to bed early, determined to finally get a good night's sleep. I was exhausted, physically and mentally, and all I wanted was a few hours of peace. I locked my bedroom door, hoping that this would somehow help me feel safe. I even left the bedside lamp on, just in case. I dozed off, but not for long. Somewhere in the middle of the night I woke up with a jolt. The room was pitch black, my bedside lamp had gone out. I reached out to turn it on, but it wouldn't budge. My heart started pounding, that old familiar feeling of being watched was creeping up on me. And then I heard it. The sound of someone moving outside my door. It was faint, almost like a shuffle, but unmistakable. It took my breath away. I told myself it was the wind, a draft, anything that made sense. But the footsteps came again, this time right outside the door. I sat up, staring intently into the darkness, listening, hoping they would stop. But then I heard the rattle of the doorknob. Something was trying to get in. In a panic, I grabbed my phone, trying to turn on my flashlight, but my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't even hold it steady. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. No footsteps, no clattering. Just silence. I thought maybe it was over. But when I was about to get out of bed and leave the room, I realized that the door would not open. It was locked. From the inside. And only I had the keys. I tried everything to open the door, pushing, pulling the handle. But it would not open. I was trapped in that room, and I started to panic. I could feel the walls closing in, the air getting colder, as if the room itself was suffocating me. Finally, after a few hours, the door opened by itself. I didn't wait to find out who opened it. I grabbed my bag, the clothes I could reach, and ran out of that house without looking back. I didn't care that I had left half of my belongings there, I just knew I couldn't spend another night there. The next morning, I rented a hotel room, arranged to sell the house at a loss, and packed my things to leave the city. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted to leave. It's been 15 years since I left that house behind. Now I'm on the other side of the world, living in another country, with a completely new life. But from time to time, late at night, I will think about that place. I'll remember the heavy air, the shadows that seemed to stretch out and chase me, the sounds that echoed in the empty corridors. It's like a bad dream that never completely disappears, that comes back into your mind just when you think you've forgotten about it. I never went back to that city and never wondered what might have happened in that house before I moved there. Maybe I didn't want to know. Some things, I think, are better left in the dark. Sometimes I wonder if the new owners, if they ever felt what I felt, if they ever heard those footsteps, if they ever felt that cold presence watching them. I've tried to put it all behind me, but that night still haunts me, the night I woke up to find myself locked in my room and someone or something standing outside the door. I've had a lot of time to think about it, to try to make sense of it, but I don't think I'll ever fully understand what happened. And maybe that's okay. Some things are just not meant to be understood. All I know is that I was alone in that house, and yet I wasn't. I felt it, I saw it. Whatever it was, it didn't want me there, and I was smart enough to listen. Now, when people ask me why I moved so far away, I just shrug my shoulders and say that I wanted to start from scratch. I don't tell them about the house, or the steps, or how I felt the stairs even when I knew I was alone. It's just something I keep to myself, A reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you can see, but the ones that lurk just beyond the edge of the light. And every time I close my eyes and think about that house, I feel grateful for one thing: I got out of there.